The easiest way to underestimate someone is to judge the uniform instead of the heart wearing it. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed Sterling House in warm golden light as the city's wealthiest executives, celebrities, and investors filled every table on a bustling Friday evening. Fine china reflected the candlelight, quiet jazz drifted through the dining room, and every polished surface whispered luxury. It was the kind of place where success was measured by expensive watches, tailored suits, and reservation lists booked weeks in advance. Among the elegantly dressed servers moved Ethan Brooks, a 38-year-old single father whose pressed white shirt, black apron, and calm smile made him nearly invisible to those who believed greatness could only be found behind a corner office door. Every movement he made carried quiet confidence. Every guest received the same warm greeting. Every request was answered with patience that never appeared forced. Ethan had learned long ago that respect, offered freely, often revealed far more about the giver than the receiver. At exactly 7 o'clock, the restaurant entrance opened, and conversations gradually faded. Claire Harrington stepped inside with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to commanding every room she entered. As the billionaire chief executive officer of Harrington Dynamics, she had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America before turning 35. Business magazines celebrated her discipline. Financial analysts admired her decisions. Competitors feared her determination. Employees respected her brilliance, although few truly knew her beyond the polished image presented to the world. Wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and carrying herself with flawless composure, Claire crossed the marble floor while the restaurant manager hurried forward to welcome her personally. Ethan approached with the same professional courtesy he offered every guest. "Good evening, Ms. Harrington. Welcome back. Your table is ready." Claire barely acknowledged him before taking her seat near the panoramic windows overlooking the sparkling skyline. "Sparkling water," she said, while reviewing messages on her phone. "Room temperature. No lemon. Please try not to complicate something so simple." Ethan smiled politely. "Of course." A few moments later, he returned carrying an unopened bottle and a crystal glass. As he poured the water with steady hands, another server passed behind him, brushing lightly against his shoulder. The surface of the water rippled gently inside the glass without spilling a single drop. Claire looked up immediately. Her expression hardened. "Unbelievable," she said loudly enough for nearby diners to hear. "Does professionalism not exist anymore?" Several conversations stopped. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan remained perfectly still. "I apologize if your experience has been anything less than excellent. I would be happy to replace it." Claire leaned back, crossing her arms. "Replace the water? Maybe the restaurant should replace the waiter instead." A few nervous laughs escaped from distant tables before fading into silence. Ethan neither defended himself nor lowered his eyes. He simply stood with quiet dignity. "If another server would make your evening more enjoyable, I will gladly arrange that." Claire gave a faint, dismissive smile. "That is exactly why people stay stuck in jobs like yours. You confuse politeness with success." The entire dining room seemed to stop breathing. Managers watched from across the room. Servers froze beside their tables. Even the pianist allowed the final note of the melody to fade into silence. Ethan met Claire's gaze without anger or embarrassment. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You are welcome to mock me again if you believe it will improve your evening," he said softly. "But another person's job has never determined their worth." No one spoke. The quiet words settled over the room more powerfully than any argument could have. For the first time in years, Claire found herself staring at someone who showed no desire to impress her, fear her, or challenge her. He simply refused to let her opinion define him. She looked away first, unsure why his calm unsettled her more than open defiance ever could. Ethan gave a respectful nod before returning to his work, as though nothing unusual had happened, unaware that the brief exchange had just begun a journey that would quietly challenge everything Claire Harrington believed about success, respect, and the true measure of a remarkable life. The restaurant slowly returned to its elegant rhythm after Claire Harrington's dinner ended, but something invisible had changed. Guests resumed their conversations. Waiters continued carrying polished silver trays, and the pianist welcomed another familiar melody into the softly lit dining room. Yet more than one customer quietly glanced toward Ethan Brooks as he worked with the same steady smile he had worn before the uncomfortable exchange. He thanked every guest for visiting, wished each family a pleasant evening, and helped a young co-worker clear tables before anyone asked. By the time the last customer walked through the front doors, there was no trace of frustration on his face. He carefully folded his black apron, thanked the kitchen staff for another successful night, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city sparkled beneath thousands of lights as traffic drifted through downtown streets in an endless stream of motion. Ethan climbed into his aging blue pickup truck, smiled as the engine hesitated before starting, and gently tapped the steering wheel. "Come on, old friend. One more ride home." 20 minutes later, the towering office buildings gave way to quiet residential streets lined with mature maple trees and modest apartment buildings where porch lights glowed warmly against the night sky. Ethan parked beside a small brick building and carried a paper grocery bag under one arm as he climbed the familiar staircase. Before he could unlock the apartment door, it suddenly flew open. "Daddy!" 8-year-old Sophie Brooks wrapped both arms around him so tightly that he almost dropped the groceries. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with excitement, and loose strands of golden hair framed a smile that instantly erased every difficult moment from his day. Ethan laughed softly as he hugged her back. "Now that is the best welcome home I have received all week." Sophie looked up with playful seriousness. "You are 12 minutes late." "Am I really?" "I counted." Ethan placed one hand over his heart. "Then I clearly owe someone extra pancakes tomorrow morning." She nodded proudly. "Chocolate chips, too." "That sounds like a very fair deal." Inside, the apartment was simple but filled with warmth. A bookshelf held children's novels beside framed family photographs. A colorful drawing covered the refrigerator door. On a small wooden table rested a picture of a smiling woman whose gentle eyes looked remarkably like Sophie's. Fresh vegetable soup simmered quietly on the stove while homemade bread cooled on a kitchen towel. Ethan glanced toward the photograph before helping Sophie set the table. "Did school go well today?" he asked. Sophie grinned. "I got every spelling word right. I never doubted you." She became quieter for a moment before looking toward the framed picture. "I told Mommy when I got home." Ethan followed her eyes and smiled gently. "I think she heard every word." Sophie reached into her backpack and carefully unfolded a sheet of paper decorated with crayons. Across the top, she had written "My Hero." The drawing showed Ethan wearing his waiter uniform while holding her hand beneath a bright yellow sun. "My teacher said we should draw someone brave," she explained. Ethan looked at the picture much longer than she expected. His eyes softened, and he knelt beside her. "Thank you, sweetheart." She wrapped her arms around his neck once again. "You always take care of me." Later that evening, after homework was finished and bedtime stories were read, Ethan quietly counted the remaining cash inside an old envelope marked rent. There was not much left after groceries, school supplies, and utility bills, but he never sighed or complained. Instead, he tucked the envelope neatly into a kitchen drawer before checking that Sophie's blanket covered her shoulders. Outside, the city celebrated power, wealth, and achievement beneath glittering skyscrapers. Inside a modest apartment, a father measured success by warm meals, bedtime stories, promises kept, and a little girl's peaceful smile. Miles away, Claire sat alone in her luxury penthouse, looking across the same city skyline, unable to explain why the calm eyes of a humble waiter continued to follow her thoughts long after the dinner had ended. Monday evening arrived with a crisp spring breeze, and Sterling House prepared for another busy night beneath its glowing crystal chandeliers. Every table had been polished to perfection. Fresh flowers rested at the center of each white linen tablecloth, while the soft notes of a grand piano floated gently through the elegant dining room. Ethan Brooks arrived 30 minutes early, as he always did. He greeted every coworker by name, helped a new server arrange silverware correctly without making him feel embarrassed, and quietly fixed a table that wobbled slightly before any guest could notice. He believed excellence was built from small details that most people never saw. Across town, Claire Harrington finished another demanding board meeting inside the headquarters of Harrington Dynamics. Despite approving a major acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars, she found herself distracted by an unexpected memory. She kept hearing the calm voice of the waiter who had refused to let her opinion define him. Irritated by her own curiosity, she decided to return to Sterling House that same evening, convincing herself it was only because the restaurant served excellent food. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the familiar black sedan stopped outside the entrance. Claire stepped inside wearing another elegant charcoal business suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her confident posture drawing respectful attention from employees and guests alike. Ethan welcomed her with the same genuine smile he offered everyone. "Good evening, Ms. Harrington. It is nice to see you again." She looked directly at him for a brief moment before answering. "Good evening." There was no sarcasm in her voice this time, only quiet restraint. Throughout dinner, she observed him without making it obvious. He remembered returning guests by name. He noticed when an elderly gentleman needed a chair with stronger back support before the man even asked. He quietly replaced a child's dropped napkin with a clean one while making the little boy laugh instead of feel embarrassed. Every action appeared effortless, yet nothing escaped his attention. As dessert was being served to another table, a distinguished older gentleman entered the restaurant carrying a polished wooden cane. His silver hair was neatly combed, and although age had softened his posture, his sharp blue eyes still carried remarkable presence. Ethan immediately walked toward him with unmistakable warmth. "Good evening, Mr. Whitaker. It is wonderful to see you again." The older man smiled broadly. "Ethan, my friend, still making this place better simply by walking through the doors." Ethan laughed quietly. "I only carry plates. That is what humble people always say." Their conversation lasted less than a minute before the gentleman was escorted to his table. Claire watched the exchange with growing curiosity. She recognized the visitor immediately. Richard Whitaker had retired after leading one of the nation's most respected manufacturing companies for more than 20 years. Universities invited him to speak. Business leaders sought his advice. Yet he had greeted a waiter with the familiarity usually reserved for trusted colleagues. After finishing his meal, Claire approached the gentleman near the entrance. "Mr. Whitaker," she said politely, "I am Claire Harrington." He smiled warmly. "I know exactly who you are." She hesitated before asking the question that had lingered in her thoughts all weekend. "May I ask how you know Ethan Brooks?" Richard studied her expression for a long moment before answering with a knowing smile. "You are asking the wrong question." Claire looked puzzled. Richard gently rested both hands on the handle of his cane. "The better question is why a man capable of standing at the head of a boardroom chooses to serve dinner with a smile instead." Before Claire could speak again, he tipped his hat politely, stepped into the waiting car outside, and disappeared into the city night, leaving behind a mystery far greater than anything she had expected to discover. The question Richard Whitaker had left behind refused to disappear from Claire Harrington's thoughts. By the following morning, she stood inside her corner office, overlooking the city, yet the breathtaking skyline brought her none of its usual satisfaction. Financial reports covered her desk. Market forecasts flashed across multiple monitors. Her executive assistant reviewed the day's schedule, but Claire barely heard a word. She finally closed a folder in front of her and spoke quietly. "Find out everything you legally can about Ethan Brooks." Her assistant looked surprised. "The waiter?" Claire nodded. "Yes, something about him does not make sense." By late afternoon, a slim personnel file rested on her desk. Claire expected to discover an ordinary employment history. Instead, she found almost nothing. Ethan had worked at Sterling House for nearly 5 years. Before that, only a handful of temporary consulting positions appeared, each lasting just a few months. No interviews, no social media presence, no public awards, No controversial headlines. It was as though someone had carefully erased an entire chapter of his professional life. Claire leaned back in her chair. Nobody simply disappears, she whispered. Her assistant answered honestly. We searched every public source available. There is very little to find. Claire closed the file, more intrigued than satisfied. That same evening, Ethan arrived at Sterling House, carrying a small box of homemade blueberry muffins. He quietly placed them inside the employee break room with a handwritten note that simply read, "Please enjoy." A young hostess smiled as she opened the box. "Did you bake these?" Ethan laughed softly. "My daughter insisted we make enough for everyone." "She must adore you." Ethan's eyes brightened. "She reminds me every day how lucky I am." Before the dinner rush began, a nervous new server accidentally assigned 2 reservations to the same table. Panic spread across her face as guests began arriving. Ethan walked over without drawing attention. "Take a slow breath," he said gently. "Move the anniversary couple to the window. They mentioned loving the city view when they booked. Seat the business clients near the fireplace. They will appreciate the quieter space." The young server blinked in surprise. "How did you remember that?" Ethan smiled while adjusting a menu. "People usually remember how you make them feel long after they forget where they Saturday." Minutes later, the problem disappeared without a single complaint from any guest. Ethan quietly returned to polishing wine glasses as though nothing unusual had happened. Later that evening, Richard Whitaker returned for dinner with 2 longtime friends. As Ethan greeted them warmly, Richard introduced him without hesitation. "Gentlemen, this young man understands leadership better than many people who occupy executive offices." Ethan chuckled politely. "You continue to exaggerate, Richard." One of the guests smiled. "Humility has always been your greatest habit." Claire had witnessed the entire exchange from across the dining room. Curiosity finally overcame hesitation. After the gentlemen finished dinner, she approached Richard near the entrance. "May I ask you one more question?" Richard smiled knowingly. "You're still thinking about Ethan." Claire nodded. "Every successful person I respect seems to respect him." "Why?" Richard looked through the restaurant toward Ethan, who was helping an elderly couple put on their coats before they stepped into the chilly evening air. "Because character recognizes character," Richard answered quietly. Long before Ethan ever carried a serving tray, he carried responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most executives I have known. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. "Who was he?" Richard smiled gently, but shook his head. "That is not my story to tell." He paused before adding one final sentence. "But I will give you this much. If you believe he became a waiter because life defeated him, then you have misunderstood both the man and the meaning of success." Richard stepped outside into the cool night, leaving Claire standing silently beneath the warm restaurant lights, realizing that every answer she uncovered only revealed an even greater mystery waiting beyond it. Thursday evening brought an unusual energy to Sterling House. Every private dining room had been reserved. The finest crystal glasses shimmered beneath the chandeliers, and the executive chef personally inspected every course leaving the kitchen. Word had quietly spread among the staff that Harrington Dynamics would be hosting one of the most important business dinners in the company's history. Claire Harrington was meeting with the leadership of Blackstone Strategic Partners, a global investment firm considering a multi-billion-dollar expansion project. Months of negotiations had led to this single evening. One successful meeting could shape the future of thousands of employees. Ethan Brooks noticed the nervous atmosphere the moment he arrived. Managers checked reservation lists repeatedly. Senior servers rehearsed every detail. Even experienced employees spoke more softly than usual. Ethan simply adjusted a slightly crooked centerpiece, helped a coworker carry extra dinnerware into the private room, and quietly wished everyone a successful evening. "We will do just fine," he said with his familiar smile. People usually remember calm more than perfection. Shortly before 6:30, Claire entered with her executive team. She acknowledged Ethan with a brief nod before walking toward the private dining room. It was the first time she had greeted him without distance in her eyes. Ethan returned the gesture with the same respectful warmth he offered every guest. As dinner progressed, conversations flowed smoothly between company leaders and investors. Discussions centered on innovation, logistics, international growth, and long-term strategy. Then, without warning, everything changed. One of Blackstone's senior partners opened a financial presentation that had just been distributed electronically moments earlier. His expression immediately tightened. "These projected operating costs do not match the assumptions we reviewed last week," he said calmly. The room fell silent. Claire reached for her tablet and quickly realized he was correct. Two different versions of the financial model had somehow been circulated. The revenue assumptions belonged to the updated proposal, while several expense projections came from an older draft. Individually, each document was accurate. Combined together, they created the appearance of serious inconsistencies. Questions began arriving from every side of the table. Claire's chief financial officer attempted to explain the mistake, but the discussion grew increasingly confusing as multiple executives compared different spreadsheets. Confidence slowly disappeared from the room. Outside the private dining room, Ethan prepared fresh coffee for the meeting. As he approached the doorway, he noticed the unusual silence inside. The restaurant manager quietly stopped him. "Leave the tray here," he whispered. "The meeting is going badly." Ethan glanced through the partially open door just long enough to notice two financial summaries lying side by side on the conference table. Even from a distance, one detail immediately stood out. The reporting periods printed at the top of each document were different. Ethan looked at the manager. "May I offer a simple observation if they ask?" Before the manager could answer, Claire noticed him waiting respectfully outside. She remembered Richard Whitaker's words, the quiet confidence Ethan carried every day, and the countless small problems he solved without seeking recognition. After a brief hesitation, she spoke. "Ethan, would you step inside for a moment?" Every executive turned toward the waiter with visible confusion. Ethan entered calmly, placing the coffee service neatly on a side table before looking toward the reports. He did not touch the documents. He simply observed them. "May I ask one question?" he said politely. Claire nodded. Ethan looked toward the chief financial officer. "Were these reports prepared using the same reporting period?" The executive blinked before checking both cover pages. His eyes widened immediately. "No," he admitted quietly. "One is based on quarterly operating assumptions. The other uses annual projections." Ethan smiled gently. "Then perhaps the numbers are not disagreeing with one another. Perhaps they're simply answering two different questions." Silence filled the room. The chief financial officer quickly reorganized the presentation using matching reports, and within minutes the apparent contradiction disappeared completely. The senior partner from Blackstone slowly smiled. "That makes perfect sense," he said. Claire looked across the room at Ethan with quiet disbelief. He had not rescued the meeting by showing off extraordinary genius. He had simply noticed the one small detail everyone else had overlooked. As Ethan quietly returned to serving coffee, no one realized that the simplest question asked that evening had just become the beginning of the answer Claire had been searching for all along. The meeting concluded far differently than anyone had expected. What had nearly become an embarrassing collapse transformed into a productive evening filled with renewed confidence and thoughtful discussion. Blackstone's strategic partners agreed to continue negotiations, praising the transparency with which the misunderstanding had been resolved. As executives shook hands and exchanged business cards beneath the warm chandelier light, Ethan Brooks quietly collected empty coffee cups and dessert plates, moving through the room with the same quiet professionalism he had displayed since the beginning of the evening. He neither accepted praise nor lingered near the conversation. For him, the work itself had always mattered more than being noticed. As the final guest prepared to leave, the chairman of Blackstone paused beside Ethan. "Young man," he said warmly, "thank you for asking the question none of us thought to ask." Ethan smiled modestly. "Sometimes a different perspective is all a problem needs." The chairman nodded with genuine respect before walking toward the exit. Claire Harrington watched the exchange from several feet away. She had spent years identifying exceptional talent, negotiating billion-dollar agreements, and building leadership teams, yet she had failed to recognize extraordinary character standing directly in front of her. That realization followed her home more persistently than any unfinished business proposal ever had. The following morning, instead of driving directly to corporate headquarters, Claire made an unexpected detour to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. A modest lakeside home overlooked calm water, surrounded by tall pine trees, gently moving in the morning breeze. Richard Whittaker welcomed her with a friendly smile before she even reached the front porch. "I thought you might." "Come," he said, opening the door. Claire accepted a cup of fresh coffee, and the two settled onto wooden chairs overlooking the peaceful lake. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Claire looked toward the still water and quietly asked, "Who was Ethan before he became a waiter?" Richard smiled thoughtfully. "That is a better question." He leaned back and folded his hands. "Years ago, Ethan Brooks graduated first in his business school class. Before his 30th birthday, he helped create a technology consulting company that specialized in solving supply chain problems for manufacturers across the country. Investors admired his ideas. Employees admired the way he treated people. Clients trusted him because he listened before he spoke." Claire remained silent, absorbing every word. Richard continued. "The company grew quickly. Financial success arrived earlier than anyone expected. He could have spent the rest of his life sitting in executive offices just like yours." Claire lowered her coffee cup. "Then why did he leave?" Richard looked toward the lake where sunlight danced across the gentle waves. "His wife became seriously ill. Ethan sold his ownership, stepped away from the company, and devoted every day to caring for her and raising their little daughter. After she passed away, several corporations offered him executive positions. He thanked every one of them and declined." Claire whispered, almost to herself, "He chose a completely different life." Richard nodded. "Not because he lacked ambition, because he understood priorities." A gentle smile crossed the older man's face as he remembered another conversation years earlier. "I once asked him whether he regretted leaving such extraordinary success behind." Claire listened carefully. Richard repeated Ethan's answer exactly as he remembered it. "Money can always be earned again. My daughter's childhood cannot." The words settled into the quiet morning air with remarkable simplicity. Claire stared across the lake, realizing that every achievement she had celebrated throughout her career suddenly seemed incomplete beside one father's quiet decision to place love before prestige. For the first time in many years, the billionaire who had built an empire without hesitation found herself wondering whether the greatest measure of success had never been found inside a boardroom at all, but inside a small apartment where a little girl still believed her father was the bravest man in the world. 3 days passed before Claire Harrington returned to Sterling House. During those 72 hours, she attended investor meetings, approved expansion plans, and signed contracts worth millions of dollars. Yet every accomplishment felt strangely quieter than usual. More than once, she caught herself remembering Richard Whittaker's words instead of the figures projected across conference room screens. She thought about the father who had willingly exchanged prestige for bedtime stories, quarterly bonuses for school concerts, and executive titles for the chance to hear his daughter say good night every evening. It was a choice she could understand intellectually, but only now was she beginning to understand emotionally. On Friday evening, she entered the restaurant alone. There were no executives following behind her, no assistants carrying briefing folders, and no security team waiting nearby. She requested a quiet table beside the large windows overlooking the city lights. Ethan Brooks noticed her arrival immediately and approached with the same calm smile he had offered on every previous visit. "Good evening, Ms. Harrington. Welcome back." Claire looked up and, for the first time since they had met, answered with genuine warmth. "Good evening, Ethan." Hearing his own name spoken so naturally caused him to pause for only the briefest moment before he handed her the menu. "May I recommend the herb-roasted salmon this evening? The chef has prepared a new sauce that has become very popular." Claire smiled faintly. "I trust your recommendation." Ethan nodded politely and disappeared toward the kitchen. Throughout dinner, Claire quietly observed him once again. He noticed when an elderly guest struggled to read the menu and discreetly brought a larger print copy without being asked. He patiently explained ingredients to a young couple celebrating their anniversary. He congratulated a little boy on finishing his vegetables before surprising him with a small scoop of vanilla ice cream the chef had prepared. None of these moments attracted applause. No one except Claire seemed to notice how naturally kindness flowed through everything Ethan did. When dinner ended, Ethan returned carrying a small dessert plate. "Compliments of the chef," he said. "He wanted to thank you for choosing to spend another evening with us." Claire looked at the warm slice of apple pie and then back at Ethan. "Would you sit down for just a minute?" Ethan glanced across the dining room to be certain every guest had been cared for. Satisfied that his co-workers had everything under control, he pulled out the chair opposite her. Silence settled gently between them before Claire finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. "The night we first met, I judged you because of your job. I spoke to you with disrespect, and I convinced myself that success gave me the right to do it." She lowered her eyes briefly. "I was wrong." Ethan rested his hands calmly on the table. "We all misjudge people sometimes." Claire slowly shook her head. "No, I chose to." Another quiet pause followed. "Richard told me about your past," she continued softly. "He also told me why you left it behind." Ethan smiled with gentle gratitude. "Richard has always been kinder to me than I deserve." Claire looked directly into his eyes. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I wish my wife were still here every single day. I have never wished away one afternoon I spent with her or one evening I spent raising Sophie." Claire felt her throat tighten. Ethan continued in the same peaceful voice. "Careers can be rebuilt. Childhood cannot. Once those years are gone, no amount of success can buy them back." Claire nodded slowly as understanding settled deep within her heart. "You changed the way I think about success." Ethan smiled kindly. "Perhaps success has simply been waiting for you to define it differently." Claire returned the smile, and for the first time since building her company, she left a business conversation carrying no contracts, no financial reports, and no strategic plans. Only the quiet realization that the greatest leaders are often the ones whose character speaks long before their accomplishments ever need to. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm neither Ethan Brooks nor Claire Harrington could have predicted. Harrington Dynamics officially finalized its partnership with Blackstone Strategic Partners, and financial publications praised Claire's disciplined leadership. But inside the company, something far more meaningful had begun to change. Employees noticed that their chief executive officer no longer hurried past reception desks without saying hello. She began eating lunch in the company cafeteria instead of her private executive dining room. She visited new employees during orientation, asked about their families, and encouraged every manager to remember that respect should never depend on a person's title. Some executives quietly wondered what had caused such a remarkable transformation. Claire simply smiled and continued leading differently. One warm Saturday afternoon, sunlight poured across a peaceful city park where children laughed beneath blooming maple trees and colorful kites floated high against a bright blue sky. Ethan sat on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree while reading from Sophie's favorite adventure novel. Sophie raced happily across the grass, her laughter carried gently by the spring breeze as she chased a red kite dancing above the open field. A familiar voice interrupted the peaceful afternoon. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ethan looked up with pleasant surprise. Claire stood nearby wearing blue jeans, a light cream sweater, and comfortable walking shoes instead of her usual business suit. Without the polished image of corporate leadership surrounding her, she looked almost like an entirely different person. Ethan smiled warmly. "Not at all. It is good to see you." Sophie noticed the visitor and hurried back toward the bench. "Daddy, is this your friend from the restaurant?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, this is Ms. Harrington." Claire knelt so she could speak at Sophie's eye level. "Hello, Sophie. Your father talks about you often." Sophie's smile grew even brighter. He says nice things about everybody. Claire laughed softly. I believe that. Sophie reached into the picnic basket beside the bench and carefully pulled out a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin. Daddy always packs an extra one because somebody might need it. She held it toward Claire with complete sincerity. Would you like this one? Claire accepted the cookie with unexpected emotion. Thank you. That is very kind of you. They spent the next hour walking slowly through the park, watching ducks glide across the lake, listening to birds singing from nearby branches, and laughing as Sophie proudly demonstrated how high her kite could climb into the afternoon sky. There were no conversations about quarterly earnings, market competition, or shareholder expectations. Instead, they spoke about favorite childhood books, family camping trips, homemade pancakes, and the quiet happiness found in ordinary moments. Claire listened far more than she spoke. She noticed the patience in Ethan's voice each time Sophie asked another curious question. She noticed how he never checked a watch, never glanced at a phone, and never made his daughter feel that anything mattered more than the conversation they were sharing. As the afternoon sun slowly drifted lower across the horizon, Claire realized she had not thought about work for several hours. The realization surprised her. Looking toward Ethan and Sophie walking together beneath the golden light, she quietly understood something no business school had ever taught her. The richest people were not always those who possessed the most. Sometimes they were simply the ones who knew exactly who deserved the very best of their time. As they prepared to leave the park, Sophie reached up and gently placed her small hand inside Claire's. That simple gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it quietly touched a place in Claire's heart that years of extraordinary success had somehow never reached, and without realizing it, the little girl had become the greatest teacher the billionaire had ever known. Nearly 1 year later, Sterling House looked as beautiful as it had on the evening everything began, yet the people inside had quietly changed. Warm golden light shimmered across crystal chandeliers. Elegant music drifted gently through the dining room, and every table was filled with employees from Harrington Dynamics celebrating another successful year together. Claire Harrington had insisted that the annual employee appreciation dinner be held at the very restaurant where she had first learned that dignity could never be measured by a job title. Executives sat beside receptionists. Department managers shared stories with maintenance staff, and laughter replaced the formal conversations that had once defined every corporate gathering. Ethan Brooks moved through the room exactly as he always had, carrying trays with steady hands, greeting every guest by name whenever possible, and making certain no one felt overlooked. Nothing about his posture suggested he expected recognition. He had never served kindness because someone might notice. He served because kindness was simply who he had chosen to become. As dessert was placed before the guests, Claire quietly stepped onto a small platform prepared for the evening's closing remarks. The conversations gradually faded until the room settled into complete silence. She looked across the hundreds of familiar faces before her eyes finally rested on Ethan. Taking a slow breath, she smiled gently. Tonight is meant to celebrate the people who make our company stronger every single day, she began. But before we finish this evening, there is one person I need to thank publicly. Curious whispers disappeared as I followed her gaze toward the waiter standing quietly near the back of the room. Claire continued with calm sincerity. Almost 1 year ago, I walked into this restaurant believing that success gave me permission to measure another person's value. I judged a man because of the uniform he wore instead of the character he carried. I believed leadership was something proven through wealth, position, and influence. I could not have been more mistaken. The room remained perfectly still. Claire stepped down from the platform and slowly crossed the dining room until she stood in front of Ethan. You answered my pride with patience. You answered my disrespect with grace. Without realizing it, you taught me more about leadership than any board meeting, university, or business conference ever could. She extended her hand with genuine humility. Thank you, Ethan. Ethan accepted the handshake with the same peaceful smile that had never left him, even on the night she had mocked him. Before either of them spoke again, one employee began applauding. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire restaurant rose to its feet. The applause echoed beneath the chandeliers, not for financial success or corporate achievement, but for quiet character that had transformed hearts without demanding attention. Ethan waited until the applause gently faded before speaking. His voice remained calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear every word. "Thank you for your kindness," he said softly. "But I hope tonight is not really about me. I hope it reminds all of us that every person we meet is carrying a story we cannot see. The easiest way to change someone's life is often the simplest. Listen before judging. Respect before assuming. Be kind before you know their story." No one spoke for several moments. The silence itself became the loudest response in the room. A few weeks later, on another bright Saturday afternoon, Ethan and Sophie stood together beneath the familiar oak tree in the neighborhood park, watching a colorful kite dance high above the city skyline. Claire stood nearby, smiling quietly as Sophie laughed with the carefree joy only childhood can bring. The breeze carried the kite higher with every passing second until it floated peacefully against an endless blue sky. Claire looked upward and finally understood that the greatest victories were never announced in boardrooms or measured in bank accounts. They were found in second chances, humble hearts, promises kept, and ordinary moments shared with the people who mattered most. In the end, the billionaire never changed the waiter's life. The waiter quietly changed hers, proving that true greatness never asks to be admired because it is always too busy lifting someone else higher.